What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 179. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. I got a lot to cover on today's show, including a recent Washington Post op-ed by Matt Boot arguing that you have to either boycott both Israel and China, or it's because you hate Israel for some reason and possibly because you're anti Semitic. So I'll be arguing against that on today's show and then breaking down recent news on Russia, China, and the U.S. sanctions policy. So a lot of important stuff to cover today. Please share the show. You find it at the Libertarian Institute. And right now at the Institute, we're running our fall 2021 fund drive. It'd be really great if y'all could donate and help support the great organization we have put together there. It's Scott Horton, Sheldon Richmond, Pete Quinones, and myself, and then we have podcasts hosted by the great Keith Knight, Pat McFarlane, and Tommy Solomons, and then regular writers including Hunter DeRennis, Lori Calhoun, and frequent guests of the show, Connor Freeman. So there's tons of reasons to support the Institute. You could get yourself great kit bats. Scott offers a ton of great stuff, including signed copies of his books. And so find a bunch of great stuff to either get his kit bats or just because you love the content that we put out at the Institute. But definitely check out and support libertarianinstitute.org. And really appreciate when everybody could do that. You can also check out and help the show by subscribing on YouTube, Rumble, or Odyssey to get the video version. We have the audio version of the podcast everywhere people could download podcasts, and then we also have the show and post clips of the show on our social media accounts at Facebook, MeWe, and Twitter. The Twitter handle is @con_interest. You could support the show giving us donations directly at Patreon or Subscribestar. Also, crypto information is in the show notes page. The last thing you could do to support the show is go to PalomaVerdeCBD.com to do your CBD shopping. You use the promo code PEACE, PEACE, when you check out. And not only does that get the show a kit bat, but when you do your CBD shopping there, you'll get the top of the line, very best CBD products on the market. I really love their topicals they have at Paloma Verde and recommend them to everyone. Works great for any kind of like back or muscle pain that I have. And again, just a little bit, it has a nice menthol smell, very like wake up refreshing kind of smell to it, and recommend to anybody that's got some pain. So PalomaVerdeCBD.com, use the promo code PEACE, PEACE. That saves you 25% off when you spend $75 or more. Now let's get into the show and break down this Matt Boot article. And so again, this is his regular column at the Washington Post. This one titled "The BDS Movement Shows Its Hypocrisy by Boycotting Israel and Not China." And so I could take it on the headline level, but I just want to kind of break this down paragraph by paragraph. I think will be the best way to do it. And so he opens up his piece by saying, there's a difference in the way Western leftists treat Israel compared to Arab states. And that is, he is saying that there are Western states like the UAE, Sudan, Morocco, Egypt, Jordan, and Bahrain who have somewhat normalized relations with Israel, and yet there are Western leftists like this lady Sally Rooney who won't allow a Israeli publisher to reprint her book in I guess Hebrew. And so he's saying like those are the Western leftists that, have this irrational hatred for Israel. And look, there's other Arab states that can obviously get along with Israel. Now, there's a ton of problems in this. He even mentions the Abraham Accords. And it's not like the U.S. didn't have to bribe and have to continue to pay out bribes, to Jordan and Egypt for all these states to have normalized their relations with Israel. For the UAE, it was billions and billions of dollars of weapons, including armed drones, including F-35s, which was a major complication to the Middle East because it kicked off an arms race because Israel says, well, even if you're giving the UAE those advanced F-35 fighter jets to normalize relations, with Israel, we still demand that the U.S. uphold its quantitative military edge policy for Israel and be sure to sell Israel weapons that are superior to the F-35. So now we have to sell even more weapons to Israel because we sold these weapons to the Emirates. With Sudan, basically the deal was we took Sudan off the state-sponsored terror list, which, look, it shouldn't be about paying a bribe because we also required them to pay a $300 million settlement. What it should have been is a real evaluation of the Sudanese government, where they had overthrown the longtime dictator Bashir that had been there and was the reason for Sudan being on the state-sponsor terrorism list. So essentially, we punished a state and a population and a people who had overthrown their government that had supported terrorism by making them, normalize relations with Israel and do all this stuff to get taken off the state-sponsor terror list. And of course, with Morocco, talked about this recently on the show. The agreement is that the U.S. recognized the Moroccan occupation of the Western Sahara, which is not quite maybe on the scale. I think there's far less people living there, but there's a lot of people who live in Western Sahara who would like to be a part of their own independent state and who are essentially occupied by Morocco. And the U.S. changed, I guess, from a more ambiguous position to directly supporting them, or not supporting, but recognizing that Moroccan sovereignty over that territory. And that's what they used to bribe Morocco to recognize relations with Israel. And then of course Egypt and Jordan are two of the top states receiving, after Israel, of course, U.S. foreign aid every year. Hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars that we pay to these states is essentially bribe money to play nice with Israel. And so Matt Spoot, of course, leaves all that out of his article, but it's extremely important context. Also worth pointing out here that he lumps it up as just, this is a Western leftist kind of thing. Like, this is Rashida Tlaib, right? These are the kind of people that believe in this policy, or Ben and Jerry's, or again, Sally Rooney. And while I do not specifically endorse the BDS movement because I oppose sanctions, I'm anti-war. Sanctions are economic warfare, so I oppose sanctions on every country, even an apartheid state like Israel. However, the spirit of the BDS movement, the idea that, maybe the U.S. government shouldn't be sanctioning Israel, but at the very least, we should completely cut off all foreign aid to Israel, all military aid to Israel, preferably, severs main ties, at least, financial ones, like selling Israel weapons, funding Israeli research for their weapons and for their deep state and for their government, that kind of stuff. We should be opposed to all that kind of funding. And so, while again, I don't support sanctions, I do support that. And so, there are a lot of libertarians in my camp, very loud ones, like the great Ryan Dawson or Scott Horton, of course, Reed Coverdale, are all very, strong people advocating for the Palestinian cause and everything like that. Now, let's see, one more thing that he points out here that I think is worth talking about is he says, look, Secretary of State Antony Blinken was able to then, sit down with the foreign minister of Israel and then the Emirates all together. But what they had a conversation about, it was not like peace. This wasn't gained together. It was just trying to organize these countries and direct their hostilities towards Iran. That was, the real crux of those foreign ministers and the Secretary of State Antony Blinken meeting. Now, in the next paragraph, he has this line where he says, this comes after 9 House members, 8 far-left Democrats, and a far-right Republican voted against funding Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system. And so, this is like he's trying to, compare not giving Israel an additional $1 billion in a year where the U.S. government is going to run a multi-trillion-dollar deficit is some great affront to Israel, is the argument he's trying to make. And then calling Thomas Massie, of course, a far-right Republican. You hear the way that Matt Spoot talks about these people, the far right and everything like that. These are people he thinks are terrorists and extremists. This is a smear that he's using against Thomas Massie, when no, he is just the most, really principled Republican. As far as what the Republican Party, in my understanding, is supposed to stand for, what they at least claim to stand for. The principal vote here is to vote against giving Israel this, not only on a moral level because of the crimes the Israeli state commits and what the Iron Dome allows them to do to the Palestinians, but then also just based on the fact that you shouldn't be giving away money when your country is already running a deficit. He also mentions again here Ben and Jerry's. And so then he says the case against Israel is buttressed by an April report from Human Rights Watch, saying that Israel is committing crimes against humanity, including apartheid and persecution. If you read this article, you'll note that he puts, whenever it's an apparent Israeli crime, he almost always puts it in quotes. But when it's, a crime that he's accusing Arabs or Palestinians of, then there's no need for the scare quotes. So very interesting how he's trying to bias his readers in that case. Now, he says that, yes, the Palestinians, yes, Palestinian Israelis do face discrimination, as do Muslims in Europe, but nothing like the formal system of oppression in apartheid South Africa, whose laws were directed at black people. And, there are specific laws in Israel, including laws that declare the Israeli state the state of the Jewish people, that are, racist and discriminatory against the Palestinians. And he tries to just brush this off against, people are racist against Muslims everywhere. It's not a big deal. And of course, this is even worse because it's, people on their homeland. Now, one of the things that he tries to say that, forget all of like the discrimination that Palestinians face and all of that. Look, in Israel, it's the only place in the Middle East that you could like have an LGBTQ parade. Now, this is, one of the most like absurd like standards. What, just because the Israeli government isn't as cruel to gay people as the Saudis and everyone else, well then, you can't take a stand against Israel and what they're doing to Palestinians, even though we're talking about millions of people being denied being able to return from their home and all these other things. And by the way, I am completely opposed and would support all the same. I think companies should divest. I think people shouldn't buy products, that are made in Saudi Arabia or something like that to the, best of our abilities, of course. Same thing with the Israeli settlements, but the main thing that I'm opposed to is the U.S. government ties, funding, weapon sales, support for the Saudi state. Yeah, I think we should cut all of that as well. But it really doesn't have a whole lot to do with the LGBTQ policy of these states. More like that they're authoritarian states that are extremely repressive against in Israel, it's hard to say a minority population, but around the rest of the Middle East is typically the minority population. But it's the people without power. It's the Palestinians. It's the Shia in Saudi Arabia and all this. These people don't have the same rights. But Israel is one of the absolute worst cases where it's systematic, and of course it's always on video and things like that. And there's an organized movement, but people support defunding all these programs to support all these states. But Matt Spoop makes it just sound like it's just Israel, which isn't really the case. Now in the next paragraph, he says, look, and in the paragraph before, I want to point out that he says that the Palestinians in Israel can vote. Which is very important. Now I'll get into that a little bit more in a second. Now the next thing he says is the situation admittedly more troubling in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And again, this is the way he mitigates the fact that when the Palestinians held the Great March of Return protest and they went to the fence that separates Gaza from Israel and the rest of the Palestinian homeland, they were shot. This included medics, it included journalists, it included children, shot in the head by snipers, right? These are the kinds of cruel things that Israeli does. The people of Gaza live in almost all unilateral poverty. There's like a 50% unemployment rate. The majority of the population is under the age of 18. Like the situation there is absolutely horrific. And it's just like, the situation isn't great. He also says this is kind of because of Egypt, which of course the again fails to leave out that Egypt, has to go along with the Israel policy on this, because the sanctions that the U.S. applies are not sanctions. The aid that the U.S. gives Egypt, is in exchange for Egypt capitulating on Israel policy. And so he does say Israeli settlement expansion should end, and says outlying settlements should be dismantled. But he, wants to keep the core of the Israeli policy, and he's just, barely walking things back whatsoever. He's trying to sound like this is like a reasonable take when it's still an absolute support for apartheid is what Matt Boot is pushing here. He says, look, and Israel can't evacuate all the settlements from the West Bank. Look what happened in Gaza in 2005. Israel evacuate the settlers there, and then bing bam boom, he pretends that nothing happened. Suddenly you have the terrorist Hamas regime that just rules Gaza now. No other context given, not the way that Israel supported the rise of Hamas against Fatah, and how all this came about in the first place, and the fact that it is really the Israeli oppression, the systematic oppression of the Palestinians by the Israelis, that encourages the Palestinian people to resist and at times engage in violent resistance, right? That is, how it works. If you have oppression, if you have occupation, you're going to have insurgency, and that's, of course, the complete context that Matt Boot leaves out of all of this. Now, he says that how will Israel survive if it cannot protect itself against a terrorist enclaves located as close as Bethesda, Maryland is to DC? And I love this line here does kind of show what I don't know, an elitist this guy is. How many Americans really know how close Bethesda, Maryland is to Washington DC? And just got he knows it. He's speaking to the fellow members of his blob here, because that's the only other people that are really like, oh yeah, I know exactly how far those two things are. Now, this is the most critical sentence of his article, and the reason that I really decided to discuss it on today's show. The boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement demands a right of return to Israel for 7.25 million descendants of Palestinian refugees. That would mean Israel, which has 6.8 million Jews, would cease to be a Jewish majority state. And so here, in his article, he says the reason we know Israel isn't an apartheid state is because the Palestinians could vote. And then later in his article, he says we have to make sure that there's a Jewish majority in Israel. And so what does that say in a democracy? Jewish rule, right? If you're saying that there has to be a majority of Jews, the reason you want that is so that they rule. And then, he even puts out a tweet here saying that, BDS demands a right of return that would make Jews a minority in Israel. And, he's right here advocating right on Twitter, right out in the open, right immediately in this article, for an ethnically planned state. The reason that the Palestinians cannot return to their homeland is because it would mean that if everybody within that homeland could vote, then Palestinians would, have a majority, and then would be able to, have the government that they wanted, which isn't what Matt Boot wants. And so, it's just a crazy omission to have, something that's crazy for the Washington Post that he could just outright advocate for, and that there's, no like, oh man, this is really ugly and nasty. And look, maybe it would be one thing if this was like coming from somebody who everybody thought was a good person, like AOC or something like that. This is coming from Matt Boot, the Iraq war advocate. He doesn't have problems advocating for genocide and the death of hundreds of thousands of people. He doesn't feel bad about that. And so when he says this, he definitely means it, that, yeah, we have to make sure that there's more Jews in Israel than Palestinians. And it doesn't matter who should be on that land. It has to be an ethnically planned state. Absolutely disgusting. So then, he has this thing in here where there's 45 Muslim majority states in the world. And, this is just such an absurd thing. Like Palestine, they have their own individual culture. They're their own people. He just pretends like, oh, the Palestinians, the Egyptians, the Saudis, the Iranians, the Philippines, all these countries, they all got a bunch of Muslims there. And so they're all the same. And why can't, this Jewish state exists? And he acts like the problem is only in Israel, of course, and the only problem that people have with it is that it's a majority Jewish state, and that's not the case at all. The problem is what Israel has done to maintain that majority Jewish state, which has meant kicking tons of Palestinians out of their home. There's millions of them living in exile as refugees, and the ones who actually do live somewhat within the borders of historic Palestine, whether that's Gaza, the West Bank, or Israel proper, many of them live as second, third-class citizens, or just treated as absolute garbage, worse than somebody would treat their dog, and that's the situation that Matt Spoo is trying to brush over. So now he takes it, and he's not done yet. He says, and it's hypocritical that everybody gets so mad about what's happening in Palestine, but they don't care about what's happening. They're not calling for boycotts in China. And he particularly, not putting scare quotes around this time, says, there's a genocide being carried out against the Uyghurs. Now, of course, I've had Patrick McFarlane on the show. He has his own great documentary out on this, absolutely debunking the reports from the New Lines Institute and Adrian Zenz, these absolutely uncredible figures and institutions who have put out reports that were absolute garbage, who, try to spin policies that, yeah, China's an oppressive state, not arguing against that. Yeah, they do some bad things to the Uyghurs. There's of course independence movements in both of these places and stuff like that. I'm not trying to completely downplay it, but the U.S. claims of organ harvesting and genocide just have not borne out to be true whatsoever. Yeah, the claims of genocide rested on claims that the Chinese government was providing Uyghur women with birth control, and it's like, in any other society, if he was talking about Israel, he would be like, how great is it that the Israeli state is fine with providing women with birth control, but in the case of China, he tries to spin it into BDS. And so, then he just kind of makes those generalities and says, oh, they're committing genocide and all that. I've debunked it in the past on the show. Please either check out one of those episodes or check out Patrick McFarlane's great documentary debunking all of this. He rounds up by, just kind of saying, and the most cowardly way, he calls everybody who opposes the state of Israel anti-Semitic. He says, I hate to hurl accusations of anti-Semitism, and I freely admit that it's fair to criticize Israeli actions, but there is no denying that BDS supporters display a strange selective animus against the Jewish state. They should do some soul searching about why they are more anti-Israel than many Arab states. So again, I took on that whole thing, but just want to go one last time that he is talking about keeping the Palestinians off of their land so Israel could remain a Jewish state, and then pretending that the only reason that people could, not support that and want their government to separate for it and to boycott it themselves is maybe because of anti-Semitism. I mean, what a coward to end your article like that, where, if you're going to call people anti-Semitic, just do it, Matt Spoop. But if you don't have the actual balls to say it, then don't say it and leave it out of your article. All right. That is where I'm ending my talk on that. I gotta get into some China stuff here. Of course, the big news that we absolutely have to mention is Biden's, I guess, gaffe, I'm not exactly sure, on his town hall with Anderson Cooper. I'm just gonna play it really quick here.
Greenwich. It's great. China just tested a hypersonic missile. What will you do to keep up with them militarily, and can you vow to protect Taiwan?
Yes and yes. We are militarily, China, Russia, and the rest of the world knows we have the most powerful military in history of the world. Don't worry about whether they're going to be more powerful. What you do have to worry about is whether or not they're going to engage in activities that will put them in a position where they may make a serious mistake. And so I've spoken and spent more time with Xi Jinping than any other world leader has. That's why you hear people saying Biden wants to start a new Cold War with China. I don't want a Cold War with China. I just want to make China understand that we are not going to step back. We are not going to change any of our views.
So are you saying that the United States would come to Taiwan's defense if China attacked?
Yes, we have a commitment to do that.
All right, we're going to we got.
So that is quite the statement here, and let me explain why for people who aren't aware. The U.S. has a Taiwan's Relation Act where we say that there is a one China policy, that China and Taiwan are part of the same sovereign state, and that there should be a reunification, and the U.S. has a position of strategic ambiguity, whether it would actually come to the defense of Taiwan if it was attacked by China. And so Biden here is explicitly breaking that policy that's been in place from the Taiwan's Relation Act, a decades-long policy. I think it dates back to maybe Carter or possibly even Nixon, where the U.S. says that we're not explicitly going to come to the aid of Taiwan, although China don't even think about it because we might, and then it would be really difficult for you. And here you have Biden being asked by somebody and seeming to kind of confirm it, and then being asked explicitly by Anderson Cooper during this town hall and confirming it. Now, there were some other parts of this, and I'm not just bringing this up to dunk on the president and to be like, oh, look what a decrepit old man he is. But there's like a couple weird things that he does and says during this interview, and so maybe he's cognitively a little off here or something like that, and just is either missing the question or kind of understanding that what he's being asked here. Because, we do get official statements later that kind of say that, the U.S. policy isn't changing. But this did signal a change in U.S. policy, and was really, concerning that Biden had said that. And so people immediately took to Twitter, even like Hots like Matt Spoot I saw tweeting out, oh boy, we now have an interesting change to our policy here. And Biden didn't even seem to mention it or realize it, even when he was given an opportunity by Anderson Cooper to walk it back. And so the White House released a statement. Of course, Will Porter was absolutely great and on it within a few minutes, saying that the United States has not changed its policy on Taiwan. President Joe Biden was not announcing any change. The White House said on Thursday, after Biden vowed to come to the island's defense with a commitment to defend it. The U.S. defense relationship with Taiwan is guided by the Taiwan's Relation Act, a White House spokesperson said. We will uphold our commitment under the act. We will continue to support Taiwan's self-defense, and we will continue to oppose any unilateral changes of the status quo. And so, yeah, that has long been the U.S. policy on the issue, and the White House spokesperson then has to come out and spin after Biden makes this gaffe. Now, it is somewhat reminiscent of me to what he said in an interview. I think it was on CBS or something pretty early in his presidency. He was asked about Iranian enrichment and said no, none was allowed. Although I think this is a far more significant and problematic gaffe to make. This is going to really upset the Chinese leadership, and we've already seen that. There's an article from The Hill on the fallout here. We did have statements in the following day by the White House press secretary Jen Psaki and Lloyd Austin on this. Now, I will say none of the White House statements from the administration seem to really be a strong and firm walking back of what Biden said, which I think would have helped the situation with China a little bit. However, they did say that the U.S. policy against China hasn't changed, which I'm guessing China will understand is a signal. Now, here is the statement from the Chinese Foreign Ministry. They say, when it comes to issues related to China's sovereignty and territorial integrity and other core interests, there is no room for China China to compromise or make concessions, and no one should underestimate the strong determination and firm, strong ability of the Chinese people to defend national sovereignty and territorial integrity. So, this was a pretty strong statement. I'm guessing that there's going to be some more responses from China, whether that's missile tests, whether that's joint exercises with Russia, and we'll get into that in a little bit later, or other maybe provocative things like flying flights closer and closer to Taiwan's actual airspace, but through Taiwan's air defense identification zone, which we have talked about in this show, stretches far out into, I think, the South China Sea and even over mainland China. But, when China flies through it, it is seen as provocative from the Taiwanese side. And it's a way I think that China has been showing how upset they are with the current status quo with the U.S.-Taiwan relationship recently. So, in the days leading up to that, I just want to highlight, too, that Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin was on a trip. I think he eventually ends up in Georgia after stopping in Ukraine, but here he is meeting with NATO, and he promised broad support and predictability and sustainability in the relationship with Russia, but he says that the U.S. has a resolute commitment to NATO and broad support for both Taiwan and the European Union. So even if, Biden's statement was overly bold, that, the U.S. was going to support Taiwan and everything like that, the U.S., through its action, through statements of other officials, have been making this policy more and more clear in the recent weeks. So, while, again, Biden, I really hope it was a gaffe, and I really hope the administration is at least making efforts through bad channels, like telling the Taiwanese, or the Chinese envoy or whatever, like, hey, we still have the same old policy. Biden just made a mistake. He was a little bit confused. We may defend Taiwan if you invade, but look, you're not going to invade anyway, so nobody has to worry about this, or something like that. However, there's reasons to doubt that'll work out, because Biden's ambassador to China, this from David Camp at antiwar.com, the nominee, so this is during his confirmation hearing, says China is the greatest threat to the U.S. and to the democratic world. And if this is the statement from the envoy, if this is the position of the, person who's supposed to be the communicator between the U.S. and China, then who knows if the, right signals are going to end up getting communicated. So right now he's not in that post, I understand, but just point out that these are the people that the Biden administration is bringing in and are currently in place to have diplomacy with China, are completely anti and rabidly so on the China issue. And, to an absurd level, saying like that China is the main enemy of democracy in the world. We claim we create democracies in Iraq and Afghanistan, where nobody votes anyways in those elections, and that they're just corrupt and create more terrible situations, and those states have committed tons of war crimes. Or in Israel, we create a democracy there where we have to help the Israelis keep the Palestinians out and keep their population numbers low enough to keep that state's the Jewish majority there. Like that, these aren't democracies. These are just states that are planned by the U.S. and given the democracy label. And so, it's completely absurd what he's saying here. But that is Nicholas Burns, by the way, is the nominee, and he is the former ambassador to NATO. We also had in the past week, this before the Biden statement again, U.S. and Canadian warships sailing through the Taiwan Strait. For the U.S., it was a guided missile destroyer, a Burke class, the USS, let's see here, Dewey, and then the Canadian ship was the HMS Winnipeg, and that was a frigate. But you see, and especially if you listen to the show all the time, which you really should, of course, that the U.S. is rolling more nations. Recently was the U.K., now it's Canada, into its transversing of the Taiwan Strait. So, of course, there's so much the U.S. is doing to provoke China. Of course, people are making a big deal of China's recent hypersonic missile test. I will say that I remain skeptical of the success of this test. If anybody wants to know why, it's my general position on hypersonic missiles. And there's a great article by Andrew Coburn. It's in the London Review of Books. I highly recommend you read it if you're interested in hypersonic missiles, where he discusses the scientific limitations of the technology at this time and the reason why, he's not exactly optimistic that states are close to developing these things. And so that was the reason for my take on the North Korean recent alleged hypersonic missile test, as well as this Chinese one. However, it is possible that China is developing hypersonic missiles. That being said, it's not going to give China a first strike capability against the U.S. The U.S. has several nuclear submarines that China has no idea where they are. They're loaded up with dozens, scores of nuclear weapons on each and every one of them, enough to wipe out millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of Chinese people should China carry out a first strike nuclear attack against the US. So this doesn't really change necessarily like the balance of power between the US and China or anything like that. Now it does make the US missile defense systems that we're spending trillions of dollars on less relevant, but the US should look at this not as a really a problem for we got to spend more money on missile defense and developing our own hypersonic missiles, but rather, a need to start to negotiate arms defense deals and arms restrictions deals with Russia, with China, engage in talks with North Korea, and just let's stop carrying out these tests and not waste trillions of dollars on it after we just wrecked all of our economies. Let's not waste a whole bunch of our time, our brightest minds, sinking money in to these technologies that at the very best, the very best case, if you develop a hypersonic missile with a nuclear warhead, is that thing sits there and collects dust forever, because if it gets used, it's going to kill everyone. So those are, just some of the problems with, these kind of tests. Now, it's worth noting that the U.S. is carrying out our own test here. Now, there was one failed test, and this came, I believe, like mid-October. But then there were 3 more tests that the U.S. government says were successful. The failed test was apparently due to a booster, and I think that was actually the test of a hypersonic missile system, whereas the successful tests were only for components of these missiles. So that's what's going on here. We're spending so much money. Just want to talk about that a little bit because, it is important when you talk about the U.S.-Chinese relationship to understand that, at least from the Chinese perspective, if the U.S. defense budget is increasing, they're going to see that, at least their hawks in that country are going to spin that as a threat. Just like the hawks in our country, like, oh my God, China's going to spend $10 billion on hypersonic missiles. Well, the amount of money that the U.S. is spending on our military is absolutely absurd. We had the NDAA pass the House, which included, I think, about a 5% increase in overall defense spending. The Senate Dems won a 5% increase, but the GOP in the party is actually looking for a 13% increase. They want to bring the baseline Pentagon budget up to $788 billion next year. This is absolutely absurd, and this effort is being led by the ranking member, so that's the top Republican of the Armed Services Committee, and that's Richard Shelby. I think he's from Alabama. All right. Now, there's a few things going on that I think are largely in counter and reaction to the very aggressive and hostile U.S. policy towards both China and Russia. And as we saw, Chinese and Russian ships do a joint sail through the Japanese Strait. This is the waterway between, and I guess it's international water, between the Chinese mainland and then its northern island. Now, I'm not really an expert on Japan. It seems like that these countries have carried out this kind of thing individually, but not as a joint thing. And I believe these ships were a part of the group of Japanese and Russian ships that end up holding joint patrols in the Western Pacific. Now, there's a lot of reasons that Russia and China are not natural allies. There's a lot of distrust there, and even territorial issues between the two countries. But the U.S. position and aggression has led these two countries to kind of realize that one of the ways that they could maybe put themselves in a better position is to at least unite against the U.S. And we're seeing that through these particular naval drills, and also drills that I've covered in the past, like in Chinese territory. I believe they held in some drills. All right, so now some news on Russia. We have NATO agreeing to a new master plan to counter what they say is a growing Russian threat. And so this was agreed to by all the NATO defense ministers, and they say this sets up a plan to... let's see, they want to be able to attack Russia on multiple fronts, in the Balkans, in the Black Sea region, Ukraine, let's see, nudes, hacking, and space. And so this just sounds like a massive, like defense, military, industrial complex, kind of the NATO global kind of defense industry, just a massive spending plan from them. And this is going to get the basis for a lot of spending in all these individual countries. But it's also a way to say, oh my God, look how terrible Russia is. They talk about Russia moving troops closer to the border of NATO countries, but failed to mention that those troops are actually moving inside Russia. And in fact, the article is very dishonest. It then goes on to say, in May, Russia amassed some 100,000 troops on its border with Ukraine, but doesn't even mention that Ukraine is not a NATO state. So it's not even proving the point here, because, this isn't on the border with NATO. Now, some of these troops may be moving to, say, Belarus, and not actually all within the Russian border. But at the same time, the U.S. would never portray it as like, we're moving troops close to, like troop movements around and inside NATO are not portrayed as aggressive actions against Russia. And that's what the U.S. does on the flip side. And so there's one more thing in here that I just thought was kind of crazy right at the end. They talk about Russia potentially trying to develop a super weapon. Don't know what it is. Don't really get into details. But again, it just seems like a great excuse for a lot of military spending. Now, at the same time, we have our Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, and traveling to NATO and then Ukraine and Georgia. And during his trips to Ukraine and Georgia, he said that the U.S., has an open door policy for membership. Of course, Biden recently, the U.S. says that these two countries could join, but they have to be less corrupt. And my guess is that there's no real interest in the U.S. in really evaluating them on their corruption level. However, the corruption level is so high, I don't think it's going to come into, that's not the real issue. That's just used like kind of as a fig leaf to say, oh no, we can't let you in at this point. But Austin does go and says that, and this of course provokes a Russian reaction, saying that this would violate a Russian red line. Ukraine has a very long border with Russia. They feel it would put their country in a lot of danger. This would be like, if the U.S. fell apart after the Cold War, and then it's now, Russia that has suspended the Warsaw Pact all the way through Western Europe, Ukraine, France, etc., and now is actually considering bringing in Canada. And the U.S. is saying, we may not be the superpower we once were, but we still have a massive nuclear arsenal and a pretty large military, and we don't think that you're actually willing to fight us over Canada. So if you go ahead and you overthrow the government of Canada, and then you put that country into the Warsaw Pact, we would go to war over that. And that's the red line that Russia is drawing right here. Now, of course, the U.S. always talks about Russia aggression, Russia aggression, Russia aggression. However, it's actually the U.S. We recently flew B-1 bombers over the Black Sea. Of course, this is pretty close to the Russian border. They scramble fighter jets to intercept. We also have our bombers, the B-1B bombers, which, by the way, can carry a large payload. They had to scramble their fighter jets to intercept these bombers again in the Sea of Japan. And so imagine if this was happening to the United States. We have Russian bombers flying off of the coast of San Francisco, and then a couple days later, the coast of Washington, D.C. or New York City. Of course, this is Russian aggression, right? But nobody talks about the American aggression that we're constantly pointing towards Russia. Now, one last story on Russia here that's pretty important, and that is diplomats were I guess the diplomats that were between NATO and Russia. So Russia had a mission in NATO, and then NATO had a mission in Moscow, I believe. What happened first was that NATO had expelled 8 Russian diplomats, alleging that they were spies. So Russia responded by just suspending its mission to NATO and then closing NATO's mission in Moscow. And this will be effective November 1st. This is going to take away a key line of diplomacy between the two sides here. And while look, this is the 21st century now. This is, 2021 really, where Zoom is a thing, and these meetings should occur. However, these are entrenched bureaucracies, and I really think that having these missions open, even if there's not a ton of face-to-face meetings, even if they're sitting in Moscow, having Zoom meetings with their counterparts in the Kremlin or something like that, still a hell of a lot better than having these buildings closed, much less the face-to-face meetings and everybody actually getting to know each other. These lines of communication are important, and taking them away, I really think harms the relationship and is a really big deal. Now, one last thing I'm going to get into. I'm going to do it rather quickly here. I wish I spent a little more time on it, but it'll be fine. The U.S. has concluded its sanction review policy. This is something that the Biden administration put together, announced originally. The Treasury Department undertook it. It took like 6-7 months for them to put this together. Spoiler alert on sanctions, not much, if anything, is changing. The big news here is that they want to target cryptocurrencies. And so let me talk a little bit about that here. The Biden administration on sanctions, let's talk about that part first. The Treasury Department said that the widespread use of sanctions, and this is something that I have been saying even on the old show, I think episode 4, where sanctions are stupid, they don't work, you can look it up. In there, I say one of the consequences of the broad, widespread use of U.S. sanctions will eventually be that, countries stop using the dollar, and then sanctions are going to be less effective. If you sanction China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, they all trade with each other off the U.S. dollar, and the sanctions don't matter whatsoever. You sanction North Korea, well, I think those sanctions are really cruel and economic warfare, and the U.S. shouldn't do it. However, if you're talking about just economically isolating a country, it works a hell of a lot better if you're not sanctioning the entire world. And so they kind of talk about Trump treating it like a blunt force method, and they're going to go in and do it more tactically. This almost sounds like the Obama administration, the way they came in and said that, the Bush administration's way of doing war was bad, and then they had the drone warfare and the good war in Afghanistan, all that. And so, we could even see more widespread use of sanctions because of this. They said that they would have more rigor added to the process and that new frameworks would be developed. I think this is just wonkish mumbo jumbo that means absolutely nothing. And they say that sanctions should be tied to clear policy objectives. And what this report fails to realize and talk about is that the sanctions are tied to policy objectives. The policy objectives, the problem with it is they're not tangible, right? Calling for the overthrow of Assad is not going to happen in Syria. It's just not. And so if the objective of the Caesar Act sanctions against Syria is to overthrow Assad, guess what? Never gonna happen. Sanctions aren't gonna do that. And so if you want sanctions with like a very limited goal, like let's say, you want the North Koreans to be like 5% less bad to their people, and in exchange you'll lift some sanctions. Well, that is something that you could probably happen. You want North Korea to maybe have not submarine launched missiles, no rail launched missiles, something like that. That's something North Korea probably trade away for sanctions, not to making any more nuclear weapons. Something North Korea might be willing to trade away, not giving up all their nukes, but not making any more, not activating their Pyongyang nuclear reactor. Maybe things you could get them to trade away in exchange for nuclear weapons. However, that's not what the U.S. does. They make absolutely unreasonable demands, and then even when this isn't the case, but the Treasury Department thinks it's the case, that sanctions against Iran in pre-2015 pushed them into signing the Iran nuclear deal. That's not what happens, but that's what the Biden administration and what DC pretends happened, right? And so even if that's the case and those sanctions worked, well, then they already haven't again, because like 2 years later, the Trump administration has already reimposed sanctions on Iran, demanding all kinds of other ridiculous concessions. And so, even if you do have specific objectives in mind, the administrations in the U.S. and the policy changes so frequently, and look, the dynamics change. Look, so let's say you get Iran to stop doing one thing, then the U.S. media or the war huts are going to start focusing on another thing. Oh, well, they treat their women better, so we're going to relieve some sanctions. And then, there's going to be a big post for the Washington Post or the New York Times or the FDD or some organization like that that's like, the Biden administration is about to relieve sanctions on Iran the same week that some gay person was killed or something like that, right? And they're going to say, well, you can't relieve sanctions on them because look how terrible they are. And so it's always a moving target. They say there has to be multilateral coordination. Of course, they say this and then they maintain their sanctions on Iran, which are unilateral, and in spite of our European allies who do not want those sanctions in place. And so there's really nothing by multilateral about the U.S. sanctions, at this point, and yet, that's what they say. Again, this is just like wonky kind of stuff that's trying to make it sound like it's going to be a more refined and better administration from the Biden team, and it's really not going to be the case. Now, I think the most important thing in here is saying that they're going to build technology to counter crypto. And even if this is only initially used to, let's say, try to prevent crypto transfers between Venezuela and Iran, that may be a thing. But they're going to eventually use it to, prevent crypto transfers from you and your best friend, or you and the guy you want to buy a car from, or whatever the hell you want to spend your Bitcoin on, right? They're looking to develop technology to counter cryptocurrency, and they're doing it. They're smuggling that through, this report on sanctions. And so nobody thinks it's going to be the Treasury Department, or maybe, that's not people's first thought on who's going to take away cryptocurrencies. You maybe think the NSA, the CIA, the FBI, but no, it's the Treasury that's going to work on and probably develop this technology. We also have the report finding, and this is how it's just going to be the same old policy, that they say sanctions are a part of U.S. Foreign policy and they get results, which is absolutely untrue, unless, the result you want is dead children, because that's about all sanctions can produce. Now, there's a really good article on this at antiwar.com. It's Daniel Larson's most recent. I talked too much about the Matt Spoot article and I don't have time to break it all down on today's show. But let me find it real quick here for you so I can read you the headline. The headline in this is from October 20th. Sanctions are inherently indiscriminate weapon. And he goes through and explains why sanctions are bad and why the Biden administration isn't changing. And this report is awful. And so you can check that out at antiwar.com. Everybody, thank you so much for listening. Support the Instant Institute. We're doing our fall fund drive right now. Go over and donate. It supports myself, P. Quinona, Scott Horton, Sheldon Richmond, Keith Knight, and Patrick McFarlane, Tommy Solomons, Connor Freeman, Hunter DeRenis, Lori Calhoun, Jim Bovard, a ton of great people who write for the Institute. We produce so much great content over there, and everything that you could give us really helps. You get yourself some great kit bats in return. So libertarianinstitute.org, big donate banner right at the top now. Get the show, get the daily news roundup that I write, and all the other great stuff that we have there. Thanks, everybody, and we'll be back with more shows later in the week.